Hi, this is Paul, and this is my Rough Draft for Sunday series where I walk through my sermon to the extent that it's done in preparation for Sunday. This week there was a bit in the news in the Washington Post about the boy who came back from heaven. And in 2004, 6-year-old Alex Malarkey drove home with his father, Kevin, in rural Ohio. A left turn nearly took his life. As Kevin turned the car, it collided with another vehicle, so the boy's skull became completely detached from his spinal cord. But Alex did not die, and that is the central fact between a long-running controversy that has now led to a lawsuit. Some of you may know that the father, supposedly in conjunction with his very young son, wrote this book about the boy's trip to heaven. Now, a Christian publisher made something like $10 million on this book, but things didn't go so well for this family afterwards. In 2012, Alex's mother, Beth Malarkey, wrote several blog posts saying that her family was not in agreement with the content of the book. She expressed frustration with several people calling and visiting their home over the years, saying Alex is just a boy, not a statue to be worshipped or a person with some supernatural gifts, and he does not go to heaven and have conversation with supernatural beings, and whatever visions or experience he has had or has not had is up to him as to what he will do with those. Later this month, this is from Wikipedia, she claimed that the book's account had been embellished, adding the truth is getting twisted, distorted, and packaged to be sold to the highest bidder. She also revealed that Alex himself had written a comment on the book's Facebook page in 2011, calling the book one of the most deceptive books ever. That comment was deleted, and Alex was banned from commenting after the moderator suspected he was an imposter. Beth and Kevin Malarkey had become estranged since the book was published, and this is actually a pretty sad story, where the family not only is there the tragedy of the accident and the injuries and permanent damage that this young man has suffered, but how this has torn up the family, and now he is suing the publisher to have the book to get the book pulled so that the publisher will no longer publish the book because the boy says none of this is true, and also he wants a piece of the money because he hasn't seen any of the money. And so this is a very sad story, and I would imagine a lot of skeptics out there will cheer and say, "Ha, see, okay." But my interest in this is more on the Christian side, or really not even just the Christian side, but a lot of people who jumped at the book and said, "Aha, here we have proof." Now, one of the things that I notice as a pastor almost all the time is that people get some pretty basic things about Christianity wrong. Christianity is about going to heaven when you die, and Evangelism Explosion, I think it was written by D. James Kennedy in the 60s, was a very popular evangelistic technique where you'd go to someone and say, do you know, what will you say to your God to let him into your heaven? Now, I don't think in and of itself that question is a bad one, but it does continue to work on the idea that what Christianity is about is going to heaven when you die, whereas Christians certainly do believe that Christians, when they die in the faith, they will go to be with the Lord. This is what the Bible teaches. This is not the end of the story, and this is not the whole story. People will also say things like, the Bible tells you what you need to do to get to heaven. BIBLE, basic instructions before leaving earth. And I commonly find people believe that the Bible is a set of rules or descriptions that if you keep them, you will achieve heaven, and if you fail them, you will get hell. A big problem with all of this is that you don't need the resurrection for any of this. In fact, the resurrection throws a monkey wrench into this, because if you'd follow this basic narrative that good people go to heaven when they die, well, maybe you say, well, Jesus was a good person and he died on the cross and therefore he went to heaven. In fact, this is not a new idea. This is a very, very old idea, and it was really put into what was called the Gnostic Gospels. Now, every few years, someone comes out with a Gnostic Gospel and peddles it as a suppressed gospel, and this kind of gets everyone excited because they think, oh yeah, the big, bad, powerful church suppressed these works. Well, not all, but a number of these works came out before the church had any political power whatsoever, and part of the reason that the church never looked upon these books as canonical is because the church looked at them and says it gets the basic story wrong. The story that the Bible is intending to tell is not, here are the list of rules. If you obey them, or if you're a good person, or if you are of the right tribe, then you go to heaven when you die. That is not the story of the Bible. Now, if you look at American beliefs, however, you would think that the Gnostics actually won. Pew Research Center does a lot of very interesting surveys on religion and public life, and a few years ago they did a survey on what Americans believed on a variety of things in terms of mixtures of faith and spiritual ideas, and lo and behold, they discovered Americans, in fact, are not getting less religious, they're getting more religious. In 2000 and 1990, the percentage of people who felt you were touched with someone who had already died, 17% in 1990, 18% in 1996, 2009, 29%. It's a pretty significant jump. People who've seen a ghost, that number doubled, or seen or felt the presence of a ghost, or would consult a fortune teller or a psychic. It's interesting that that number really didn't go anywhere. And what's interesting is that this kind of spirituality that you find in movies, you find just very commonly in America, isn't really Christianity. Now, a lot of people associate it with Christianity and they associate it with the Bible, but it's not really the story of the Bible. And one of the big pieces that doesn't fit into that story, that is absolutely the center of the New Testament, is in fact the resurrection. Now, the resurrection is not a story that tries to describe that there is life after death. The vast majority of people, both today and in the ancient world, believe there is life after death. And in many respects, both today and in the ancient world, people were kind of foggy on what life after death would mean. In fact, if you look at the Greek concept of Hades, which is not too dissimilar to the Old Testament, the concept in the Hebrew scriptures called Sheol, it's pretty undefined. It's pretty murky. People commonly believe that something of the person goes on after this life, but it was pretty up for grabs exactly what that would be. It's only in the intertestamental period between the end of the writing of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament that this much better formed view of resurrection came into being. You can find some of those ideas, for example, in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Now, we've started this series on Easter, and the church has these things called liturgical calendars, and in the church liturgical calendar, we are in the Easter time of year. And Luke in chapter 4 begins the story like all the other Gospels. The first day of the week, early in the morning, some women go to the tomb and they're going to finish the embalming that never was able to be completed in a proper fashion because these were observant Jews and they didn't want to violate the Sabbath. So they came early in the morning. They're worried about the stone. They don't find, they find the stone has walked away. They walk in, young man / angel / messenger tells them Jesus is not here. He told you this was going to happen. And then the women run over to the disciples, tell them what happened. Peter and John run back. They don't see him either. And then in Luke, as we looked at in last week's sermon, we had the story of the road to Emmaus. And the road to Emmaus nicely, well, you can listen to last week's sermon, nicely shows what the resurrection is intended to mean for, well, that's what Luke is trying to communicate. And then Luke ends his first book, Acts will be his second book, by beginning to set this up. So Luke 24:33 and following. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. These are the two individuals, Cleopas and the other person, either his wife or a friend. They returned at once to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them. Again, there's often a group of people around them. It's not just the 11. And we know this both in terms of a close reading of the canonical Gospels and a study of the tradition. And saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two Then the two told what had happened on the way, how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." Now that is it's basically a common phrase of saying, of blessing, when Jews would come together and greet one another. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." Now, if you look at this frightened, which is the New International Version, renders tarasso as frightened. It's in the passive here. It's the kind of stunned shock where you see something and you can't get your mind around it. And so what's happening here is, as Luke relays, Jesus shows up amongst his disciples and they are shocked. And I often, a couple of years ago, I was thinking about the resurrection, and after my father had passed, my father passed about 5 years ago. After my father passed, I began to wonder. I said, what if my father showed up again? Actually, there have been quite a few movies and TV series that have been playing with this theme over the last few years. And I don't mean The Walking Dead, where you come back as a zombie. I mean people coming back. And if my father were to show up at my door, or if my father were to show up in the home. Now, I would certainly recognize my father. I knew my father very well. I would recognize him instantly. I would recognize his voice. But if such a thing were to happen, what would I do? What would I think? How would I respond? And I think it's very much like what you'll hear from first responders and police chaplains when they, let's say there's a car accident, or this happens in the military, obviously. If the military chaplain comes to the door of a family of a service, of someone serving in the military during wartime, he'll come to the door, and of course, everyone will say once the person answering the door sees the chaplain there, they don't hear anything else. It's just blank. And this is almost the sense you have with the disciples, that Jesus comes and he shows himself to him. Now, this in and of itself is I shouldn't put my phone on the cheap plastic table. If there's a resurrection, how do you communicate this to it? Because how do you begin the conversation? What do you do if you're Jesus and what point are you making? I mean, okay, so suppose, I know some of you are skeptical and some of you profess this, but I think in many ways, hardly any of us really believe it deep in our minds. What does it mean that he's alive again? That's really the critical question. That he's alive again? Yes. What does it mean that he's alive? And when we ask that question, we're really asking, how does this change my life? How does this change how I should act? How does this change how I will behave from day to day? What will be some significant new ways that I act differently now that I wouldn't before? Let's suppose my father were to appear to me. And first of all, I would probably think a ghost. I mean, that's simply the human category that you frame it in. Well, I would, what if I could touch him? Right away, I would certainly ask him, what is this? What does this mean? Now, obviously, as a Christian pastor, he was also a Christian Reformed pastor. I would say, Dad, what does this mean? Okay. Once I get past the shock part, I want to know what this means. How does my life now have to change? And actually, a lot of these movies that you watch and TV shows that you watch about people coming back from the dead, that is the point of the show. What then do you do with the person? And again, in past sermons, I've said, I would imagine that there would be a great desire to take Jesus and bring him to Pilate and say, see, look, here he is. See the marks in the hands, the mark in the side, the mark on the feet. Ha! Well, ha, what? And there's this, I should just put this into this. I wanted to drop in a quote that I couldn't find. I keep this blog so I can categorize and keep all of this stuff that I want to find. And here I can't find the quote, but there's I don't remember who, it's in a play or something. Maybe someone will think about it in the comment section. The comment section is better than Google. So I just want to, all you all who comment and add value to this, I just have to thank you. But so there's this great, it was in a play or something where Herod hears that Jesus is arisen and he throws a fit. How dare he rise? Because the entire premise of how the world works is built on your ability to kill people and keep them dead. And so resurrection just upsets the entire world order. And so Jesus is alive. What does that mean? And so Jesus has to try to convince the disciples. Then he said to them, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, now Luke uses joy here as kind of a positive reaction to divine activity. But it's, again, they're just shocked. He says, do you have anything to eat? And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Now, obviously, the point of this is that he's not a ghost. He's real. But again, they're only just now at that moment, they can't comprehend. And in fact, it's 2,000 years later, we're still trying to figure out what this means, that they saw this man. Now, in fact, the Apostle Paul will keep working on this, and they're going to keep working on this idea in terms of how they understood Jewish theology to this point, what this means for the overall story, how this fits in, because Jesus doesn't go and, do a dance in front of Pilate or show himself to Herod or, say, okay, we're going to Rome, because, if Jesus went to Rome, well, what would happen? Just play that forward in your mind. So let's say you grab the centurion who crucified him. The centurion said, yep, I'd crucify him. You say, you all get on a boat and you all go to Rome and you all show up in front of Caesar and you say, aha, see? It doesn't work. And so actually, if you're a playwright or, you could have a lot of fun with this, which is what we do with our imaginations and with drama. You can have a lot of fun trying to figure out what this means. But so in a sense, what the New Testament really is about is trying to explain what the resurrection of Jesus means. And the creation of the church is really the product of the resurrection in the minds and lives and hearts of the witnesses of the resurrection and everyone who believed past them. And in fact, again, N.T. Wright, who's wrote this huge fat, I don't have it here at home, who wrote this huge fat book on the resurrection of the Son of God. He basically says the single greatest piece of evidence for the historicity of the resurrection is the church itself and the shape of that community and the changed lives of its people and how this moment reverberated through history, whereas there were plenty of other Jewish revolutionaries at the time. None of them changed the world like Jesus. Why not? N.T. Wright says it's because of the resurrection. Now, he said to them, this is what I told you while you were still with you. And it's like, you can talk to people, but they're not necessarily going to believe you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law and the prophets. And again, last week's sermon, I went through more of those Old Testament connections, the law and the prophets and the Psalms. Then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. Now well, what does that mean? And now where is that in terms of Pentecost, which is going to come with the Holy Spirit, where we see this dramatic change in the disciples? What does that mean? Does it mean that he talked to them? Does it mean zing, some spiritual thing happened? It's left ambiguous. And he told them, or this is how he's telling them, this is how he's opening their mind. This is what it is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations beginning in Jerusalem. Now you can see a little different message. We're getting another piece of this than what we saw on the road to Emmaus from last week's sermon. That integral in this will be repentance. Well, what do you mean by that? Now again, I think within our cultural framework, we tend to take this in an individualistic way, and we think, okay, my sins can be forgiven, so I can go to heaven when I die. And again, if that is how you define Christianity, you have reduced it to a smaller component than the much larger component that it is. But it's clearly about changing the story, and it's clearly about changing the story as understood through the whole scope of the Bible. And Jesus says, you are witnesses of these things. That is the role that the disciples and the apostles will play. They will be witnesses. They will go out and people will say, raised from the dead, huh? And they'll say, yep, I saw it. And here are the details. And here are other people who saw him. And if you want evidence of something, look at how my life changed. Now, again, let's run this tape back and let's say, I see my father. My father shows up to me and, he's not a ghost. He's not a spirit. He's not something I dream of, but he's alive. And what that means is, again, in Jesus' case, for the next 40 days, Jesus is going to be on and off with his disciples. And, again, if I were to come to you and say, yeah, my father has been visiting me, you'd say, okay, or you see me in your dreams? Nope, he's coming to visit me in the flesh. And you'd say, have you been drinking? Let's see your primary care physician and maybe get a psychological evaluation. And, because this is not normal. You're breaking the story. Now, the real question as to whether or not I would be insane, whether or not I had some psychotic break from reality, will in fact be my behavior. Because here's the thing. People will often say to me, well, they're crazy. Well, I know people who struggle with mental illness. They struggle with mental illness in fairly predictable ways. Now, they do unpredictable things, but we see the pattern. It's integrated into our worldview. And what happens in the resurrection of Jesus is that his resurrection completely changes how his disciples and his followers act to the degree that human history from this point on changes dramatically. And the vehicle for that change is, in fact, the church. Now, I know you think, well, church, people getting together and doing weird things like worshiping and singing and maybe doing some good things like feeding the homeless, or maybe doing some crappy things like lobbying against the kind of politics you want, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever you think of it, the history of the world changed. And it wasn't along the lines of how the world had changed before. It changed the world to such a degree that what was, at the end of the first century, kind of this minor heretical Jewish movement in 300 years would become significant enough that Constantine would adopt it and try to adopt that religion as the religion of the empire, and it would continue to grow to the place that it is now. Something happened. Now, to fit this in, though, you want to fit it into the story. Now, again, the story, this is my Genesis 1 representation. The story of the Bible begins with, and the Lord created the heavens and the earth. And one of the things that I often tell people is that most of the time when Christians are talking about, well, Christianity means going to heaven when you die, the story gets transformed into heaven and hell. But actually, if you read the Bible, the story isn't really between heaven and hell. The story is between the relationship of heaven and earth. And I will tell people things like, hell isn't really in the Bible. Now, everyone will gasp, and I say that to get the effect. And I say, in the New Testament, you have Gehenna and Hades, and I'm not denying the Christian doctrine of hell, but what I'm saying is that the main story of the Bible is the relationship between heaven and earth. And the story begins like this. God creates heaven and earth. And Genesis chapter 1, heaven and earth is very good. And God fills it with his glory. And Genesis 1 is a temple text, which means that in a sense, heaven and earth is his temple. And then in Genesis 2, the garden is the palace garden of the great king who owns heaven and earth. But now the gardeners rebel, and instead of just killing the gardeners, God does something extraordinary. He, in a sense, withdraws to heaven with his presence so as not to destroy the owners of the rebellion on earth. And in fact, in his retreat, there's a degree of mercy. But heaven and earth are therefore cut off. And you see that played out in the early chapters of Genesis with, for example, the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is an attempt to use political, and in their case, construction technology to build a staircase to heaven. Led Zeppelin. She's building a staircase to heaven. Why does she want to go up to heaven? She wants to build a staircase to heaven in order to take control of heaven because, as N.T. Wright notes, heaven is the control room of earth. And that's why astrology in the ancient world, if you wanted to know what was going to happen on earth, you looked up into heaven because history moved from heaven down to earth. And if you get into the symbolism conversations like our friend Jonathan Peugeot is getting into, you know, why in, for example, in the, I can't think of those Marvel comic, the Avengers, why does everything always come in through a portal from heaven? Well, there's something deep in us about this. You know, it's either coming from the, in Pacific Rim, from the depths of the ocean, or it's coming down from heaven. And so this is the story. This is how we tell stories. This is how we naturally kind of frame these kinds of stories. And so you have the development of Israel, and Israel is in a sense God's landing back into enemy-occupied earth, and Israel is to embody God's kingdom, and Israel does so poorly, God calls down the Babylonians to destroy his temple, and that then sets up the exile and sets up the second temple, which isn't as good as the first temple, and that sets up the whole story until we get to Jesus. But as you will find in the Lord's Prayer and the Sermon on the Mount, our Father who art in heaven, because that is God's temple, hallowed be your name. We worship him. May your name be great. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right there in that phrase is, in a sense, the entire story of the Bible. This is the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, what the whole story of the Bible is about. And this is, in fact, how the resurrection fits in. So if you look, for example, in the book of Colossians, in chapter 1, there's this beautiful song. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. This is the Logos at creation. And it is saying that Jesus, here identifying Jesus with the Logos, as in John, he's the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth. Notice it's not heaven and hell, it's heaven and earth. Visible and invisible. It's not just the stuff here, it's the spiritual powers and principalities as well. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, and this was thinking about, the heavenly powers that everyone in the ancient world were assuming were governing history. All these things have been created through him and for him. He was before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, there's way more than we can comment on just in this passage. This is an incredibly rich passage. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. Well, what is that referring to? That's referring to the resurrection. He is the firstborn among the dead. Now, the reason they say firstborn is because within the story, the people that Jesus is talking to all imagine that the resurrection is coming. And for example, when you get to the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, Martha says, I know that I'll see Lazarus, my brother, at the resurrection. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And so what we see here is in the resurrection, this then fits into the story. He is the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. He, in fact, now, Well, the Bible says this in a number of ways, and we're going to see them in a number of these passages. For example, at the end of Matthew, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's what Jesus says. Now, again, I often say to people say, well, I don't know if I can believe in the virgin birth. I say, okay, I understand your skepticism and your pause, but you're really going to pick on the virgin birth? Do you hear what the guy says at the end of the book of Matthew? All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. That's a big claim. And again, if you get that into your head, you have to begin to ask yourself, how am I going to live? How do I need to behave if I truly believe that is true? Ooh, I have an idea of what to put in here. As some of you know, I made a video this week on Jordan Peterson's conversation at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. And one of the really good questions was, what is religion? And Peterson's answer was, religion is however you act, basically how you express in action your axiomatic beliefs. Well, that's a little bit philosophical language, but religion is whatever it is you believe that prompts you to live the way you live. And this is exactly what's happening now with the disciples. And it's exactly what's happening with this Colossians passage, where if you believe he's risen from the dead, and he is the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And right there you have the gospel. And that's why the gospel isn't, here are some rules, and if you behave them, you go to heaven when you die, and somehow you achieve heaven. That is not the gospel. The gospel is Jesus, by his crucifixion and resurrection, inaugurates the new creation and creates reconciliation by which we can join him in the renovation of new things. Paul continues on, once you were alien from God and were enemies in your mind because of your evil behavior. Well, what does that mean, your evil behavior? Well, you are living out what you actually believed. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you have heard, and that which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, have become a servant. A couple of years ago, I was having some fun with a group, and I asked them about whether squirrels go to heaven. And of course they all, souls, blah, 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 blah. It was a trick question, of course, because the idea is that in Creation 2.0, what Christ inaugurates is the renewal of all things. We're heading towards the new heavens and the new earth. And, well, I remember a story told to me by my father of my grandfather, my grandfather is pastoring all these churches out in the prairie during the Depression. And one farmer asked my grandfather, will there be cows in heaven? Now, again, you got to forgive some of this language, because when you say in heaven, people are theologically incorrect and inaccurate, because the better question would be, are there cows on the new earth? Okay, so are there cows in heaven? Are there cows on the new earth? And my grandfather answered something to the effect of, well, if you need them to be there, they probably will. And the reason that this farmer said, he was a dairyman, like how many other Dutch immigrants, he said, because I know no more beautiful thing than the look in a calf's eyes when it's born. And I thought, wow, I've never seen a calf's eyes when it's born. But this obviously struck that farmer with a sense of beauty, and he connected that beauty and somehow saw God's glory in the face of that calf. And this is why, if you believe the gospel is just, if you do good things, you go to heaven when you die, you have such a reduced gospel that you haven't wrung all the joy out of it, because there's way more joy in that than believing, yeah, when you die, you're in the ground. The joy is bigger. The joy is fuller. The joy is richer. Because what we're actually looking for is a new heaven and a new earth. And you find this in Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. Now again, there's way more here than I can talk about right now. This isn't that God hates the ocean. This has everything to do with chaos and order. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard in a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them, God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Well, what's the point of that? Why, did something happen to the old heaven? No. The point of this is the resurrection. The point of this is that Jesus comes and they see him in the flesh and he says, I want you to know that it's me, and I want you to connect me to the Old Testament, and I'm going to enlighten the eyes of your heart so that you may begin to understand the story, and this story may frame your life, and the new world will already begin in my flesh, and it will already begin in your heart, and it will already begin out there in the world, and it is coming. And we all, like the disciples, look at him and try to get our heads around, what does this mean? How does this work? And immediately what we really want to do is to control it, which we can't do. We can't even control ourselves. Then I saw the new heaven and the new earth I just read that. Then I saw the new heaven and the new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Revelation does this back and forth thing quite a bit with its stories. And there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem. I did read this. Yep, I did. This is why I do rough drafts and practicing. Misery. And you'll notice again, I am in almost all my sermons, misery, deliverance, gratitude. Why? Because this helps me frame this terribly difficult dynamic about what does God do and what do we do, and how do our actions and God's actions fit together. Misery. When you see something you can't understand, it's doubt and it's stupor and it's denial and disbelief and not accepting. And this is exactly what happens with Jesus and the disciples, because they can't get it around their minds. And then they see him and they're filled with joy and amazement, but they don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. In fact, the entire story of the church can be framed as figuring out what to do now that Jesus is risen. And this in the midst of our half-believing hearts. And you'll notice how many times in the resurrection story Jesus tells them, you don't believe any of this, do you? Why won't you start believing? And that's probably what we should keep asking ourselves. Why won't we start believing? Why can't we start believing and seeing where Jesus fits into the story and trusting that all of this is true? Because if we actually believe this is true, we would not have the kind of worry, and not have the kind of fear, and not have the kind of doubt, and not have the kind of anxiety, and not have the kind of anxious need to control. Because we would know that the story of heaven and earth is finally a story that is far better than what we can possibly ask or imagine. This is something done for you that you could not do yourself. Could you raise Jesus from the dead? No. Can you raise yourself from the dead? No. You can't do it. It's a gift. That's why we talk about grace. It is something to be received, not achieved. Now, I've spent this whole week dealing with meek and how to understand meek and all of this stuff. Misery, deliverance, gratitude. We're I left the door open so my dog could get in and out, and I let all the bugs in. We're clueless. We don't understand. We're faithless. We stumble. We trip up. Our egos get in the way. We try to control things. We hurt one another. We hurt each other. We can't keep our word. We wobble. We fail. We trip. We fall, and then our bodies break down, and then we have excuses for all this crap we do. This is how we are. God, out of his mercy, sends his son, and we kill him. And he even uses this to change the story, and change the story in a way that blesses us. So faith itself is a gift, and you don't choose what you believe. And again, people will come to me sometimes and say, Pastor, but I don't believe this stuff. I'll say, okay, I'm not gonna really crunch down on you for that. Why? Because you're not in control of your beliefs. You're not in charge of them. You don't wake up one day thinking, I'm gonna believe in leprechauns. Maybe if you're Irish and you believed in leprechauns, you do. Otherwise, you don't. You don't choose your beliefs. But now we're going to get into Jonathan. Now we're going to get into Jonathan Haidt's Rider and the Elephant, because even though you don't choose your beliefs, you do choose how you behave, and you don't choose what you want to believe. But if you begin to want to believe something better, if you begin to want to believe a better story, you can begin to act as if it's true, so that the elephant, which is, all of the stuff that's really determining a lot of how we behave, the rider begins to train the elephant and begins to retrain the elephant in the light of the resurrection, and begins to believe that, in fact, well, as we started the sermon, as many people believe, my physical death won't be the end of the story. Okay, but am I left in all these, books about this person went, but he lied, and another person went, and he was debunked, and blah, 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 blah? No. You go back and you look at the resurrection of Jesus, and you begin building from there. And you begin by saying, what if this isn't the end of the story? What if the mire and the cloudiness and all of the ways that I can't put things together now is only, kind of like a newborn who's trying to use his hands? What if in the resurrection I will finally be freed of my sins and freed of this cloudiness? And what if in the resurrection I will actually, we sing in Amazing Grace, 10,000 years, and we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. 10,000 years, and we've got no fewer days to sit and talk philosophy, or to enjoy sports in a new creation, or to enjoy the new creation, one that we don't sully, or, on and on and on and on. What if I actually believed that? How would I live my life differently? How would I be more filled with joy? How would I be more generous? How would I be not anxious? And if you begin to understand this, then you go back and you read everything Jesus teaches, it begins to make sense. And you begin to say, if I really believed in the resurrection, I would be a totally different person. Yeah, that's what I should be. That's what he wants for me. And here's the thing, that someone might be listening to me and say, yeah, you'd be crazy. But again, here's the thing. I deal with a lot of street people and people who are homeless, and people who are alcoholics and drug addicts and bipolar and schizophrenic and schizoaffective. I deal with that all the time in terms of where my church is and all the group homes in my neighborhood. I deal with that all the time. If you really believed in the resurrection, you wouldn't be that kind of crazy. What kind of crazy would you be? You would be generous. You would not be subject to anxiety and worry. And you might say, no, I can't just choose to believe this. And I'd say, no, that's right. You can't just choose to believe this. If you want to believe this, you're going to have to start to act as if this is true. You're going to have to start to live as if this entire story that is in the Bible is your story. Well, that's about response. How you respond. If I really believe this, well, if there is no response, well, then you probably don't believe it. Because the truth is, if my father walked into this room and sat down, I'd probably put him on YouTube. And again, that's something for people who write television shows and movies to think about. But how would you respond? If there's if the resurrection doesn't mean any change in your life, you probably don't believe it. And I know that sounds harsh. And you might say, well, I want to believe it more. Well, good, me too. Well, how can I believe it more? By living within the story, living as if it's true. Over time, sometimes a very long time to us, it begins to sink in. The resurrection has begun. The renewal of all things has begun. It has started. It has started in you, but is not complete. The Apostle Paul says, externally, we are wasting away. We are aging. The age of decay is robbing us of everything. But inside, new life is beginning to live. And what does that mean? It means, again, that I don't have to be worried, that I can be less anxious because of the breaking down of my body. I can be less anxious because of, all of the things that the age of decay steals from me. That this is not the final story. And when you think about this, just live into it in your mind. Live into the resurrection. Live into the new heavens and the earth. Live into him making all things new. How does that change you? Doesn't it make you happier? Doesn't it make you less anxious? Doesn't it make you freer? Doesn't it say that even though politics goes wrong, or your finances go wrong, or you have a terrible illness, I should put Mabel into this sermon. Yeah, I'm going to put Mabel into the sermon. And you say, well, who's Mabel? What do you mean you're going to put Mabel into the sermon? John Ortberg, in his book, The Life You've Always Wanted, tells the story of, he actually gets it from someone else, gets it from a man named Tom Smith. And I'm not going to read all of this in my sermon because it would take too long, and I've got to stick to a 30-minute window. I don't have the luxury of 2 hours in a biblical series of rambling, although I ramble on YouTube plenty, which is why I'm going to ramble now. Tells this amazing story of Mabel. The state-run convalescent hospital was not a pleasant place. It is large, understaffed, and overfilled with senile and helpless and lonely people who are waiting to die. This is a true story, by the way. On the brightest of days, it seems dark inside, and the smell of sickness and stale urine. And I've been in many of these kind of nursing homes over the years, and many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. I went there once or twice a week for 4 years, but I never wanted to go there. I always left with a sense of relief, and it's not the kind of place one gets used to. On a particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped into carts, into wheelchairs, or looking completely helpless. As I neared the end of the hallway, I saw an old woman strapped to a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. I'm going to make the text bigger. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was also almost half deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropping one eye, and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand the sight, they could stand anything in the building. I also learned later that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been there, bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. I cry every time I read this story. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in the hallway. But I put a flower in her hand and said, "Here is a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." She held the flower up to her face and tried to smell it, and then she spoke. And much of my surprise, her words, although somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. She said, "Thank you. It's lovely. But can I give it to someone else? I can't see, you know. I'm blind." I said, "Of course." And I pushed her in her chair back down the hallway to a place where I thought she could find some alert patients. I found one and I stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." That was when it began to dawn on me that this was not an ordinary human being. Later, I wheeled her back to her room and learned more about her history. She had grown up on a small farm that she managed with only her mother until her mother died. Then she ran the farm alone until 1950, when her blindness and sickness sent her to the convalescent hospital. For 25 years she got weaker and sicker, with constant headaches, backaches, and stomach aches, and then the cancer came too. Her 3 roommates were all human vegetables who screamed occasionally but never talked. They often soiled their bedclothes, and because the hospital was understaffed, especially on Sundays when I usually visited, the stench was often overpowering. Mabel and I became friends over the next few years, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. Her first words to me were usually an offer of hard candy from a tissue box near her bed. Some day I would read to her from the Bible, and often I would pause. She would continue reciting the passages from memory, word for word. On other days I would take a book of hymns and sing with her, and she would know all the words from the old songs. For Mabel, they were not merely exercises in memory. She would stop in mid-hymn and make a brief comment about the lyric she considered particularly relevant to her own situation. I never heard her speak of loneliness or pain except in the stress she placed on certain lines in certain hymns. It was not many weeks before I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder, and I would go to her with pen and paper to write down the things she would say. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed to be pulled in 10 different directions with all of the things that I had to think about. The question occurred to me, what does Mabel have to think about? Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night. So I went to her and asked, Mabel, what do you think about when you lie there? She said, I think about my Jesus. I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me of thinking about Jesus for even 5 minutes. And I asked, what do you think about Jesus? She replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote, I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kind who's mostly satisfied. Lots of folks wouldn't care for what I think. Lots of folks would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me. And then Mabel began to sing an old hymn. Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He's my strength from day to day. Without him I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend. This is not fiction. Incredible as it may be, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years of pain without human company and without an explanation of why it was all happening, and she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? My answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I don't have much of. She had power. Lying there in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. Here was an ordinary human being who received supernatural power to do extraordinary things. Here was an entire life consisted of following Jesus as best she could in her situation, patient endurance of suffering, solitude, prayer, meditation on scripture, worship, fellowship when it was possible, giving when she had a flower or a piece of candy to offer. Imagine in her condition and saying, I think about how good he's been to me. He's been so awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kinds who's mostly satisfied. This is the 23rd Psalm coming to life. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. For anyone who really saw Mabel, who was willing to turn aside, a hospital bed became a burning bush, a place where this ordinary, pain-filled world was visited by the presence of God. When others saw the life in that hospital bed, they wanted to take off their shoes. The lid was off the terrarium. Then the turn came, with a catch of the breath and the beating of the heart and tears. They were standing on holy ground. Do you believe such a life is possible for a human being? That's Mabel. It's a powerful story. It does not compete with the resurrection. It fits into the resurrection. It's nested within the resurrection. Now you might say, well, blessed are the meek. Blessed are the meek if they're like Mabel, because she will inherit the new earth. C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce has this amazing piece where there's this virtual parade in heaven. And the protagonist says, who's this about? I don't recognize that woman. And the point is, this is a woman that no one would have ever known. This is a Mabel. She's a saint. She has power. Everyone in this world looks at her and says, oh, she has no power. She's a woman. She's disabled. She's been living in a crappy nursing home for 25 years. No, she has power. She has the kind of power that most of us don't dream of having. Well, how is that power displayed? Well, if you understand her power, you can begin to understand the gospel. And if you have any sense at all, you'll desire it for yourself. Well, how can I get that kind of power? How can I get my slide? What concrete steps do I need to take? Well, look at how Mabel got it. She got it through suffering. So, well, I don't want to suffer. Well, you're not going to have much power. Will you participate? Which is retraining through actions. And they're not big, grandiose actions. They're the kind of kindnesses you do to the people you live with. They're the kind of kindnesses you do to the people you work with. They're the kind of kindnesses you do to total strangers, but in a way that nobody else knows about. Will you participate? Will you worship? Worship, a dear friend of mine said to me, I don't understand church. You sing some songs, and it's hard for me to try to explain, but what we're doing when we're worshiping is we're retraining our heart. Now, if you had a friend who was in love with someone who they would never, that you knew they would never get, I mean, this is the story of chivalry, the story of Don Quixote. You might say, no, don't waste your time pining after this woman. It's never going to happen. Well, worshiping is, in a sense, that pining. It's where we practice liturgically, communally, together. We begin to retrain our hearts and refocus. And the only way Mabel had that power was she was probably that lady who went to church every Sunday. And nobody paid any attention to her. So some of the other ladies knew what gold she was, but if you walked in that church and you looked at her, you'd never pay any attention to her. And this is what the Bible talks about all the time with God putting his glory in cracked pots, in broken vessels. Well, that's Mabel. And this one guy who finally wrote the story got picked up by another pastor. I'll tell you, we're not just liars, we're thieves. We steal stories and we take them and we promote them, because a story this good needs to be told. And the thing is, you might say, wow, that's a really unusual story. Like a miracle? You'd be surprised how often I see stories like it. Maybe not this extreme, but saints who no one will ever notice. They might have some weird things in their life. They might have some ideas that I look at and say, that's a bad idea. They might have some terrible ideas. But don't we all have terrible ideas? This is what God does. Well, how do you get there? Will you live a life of gratitude? Will you participate? Will you worship? Will you grow? Will you follow your master wherever he leads? Trust, loyalty, endurance, and suffering. So, do you believe in the resurrection? Well, you think believing in the resurrection is something that just is something that sits in my head? No, it's what you act out, and it's what you live. Because if you believed in the resurrection, if you believed in the story of the Bible, it would give you power. And now you might say, I don't want the kind of power that Mabel has. And I would understand that, because you don't want to suffer the way Mabel has suffered. And you don't want to be disciplined the way Mabel was disciplined. And you don't want to devote yourself to that kind of life. Okay, well, these are the choices that you make. And I have to answer for my choices too. But when you get a sense of Mabel, you probably see glory.